Okay, we're ready to start. All right.
Excellent.
Welcome to all of our nonprofit leaders. And when you show up, can you please add a comment to let us know you're here? Just say, I'm here. I'm Nancy Manning, founder of Power Your Mission and Austin Nonprofit Meetup. And today our guest is Hale, our resident expert of all things back office. Welcome, Sean. Thank you for joining us today.
Nancy, thank you. And thank you everybody who's tuning in for wanting to sharpen the saw and serve your nonprofits and your community better. Thank you.
Good. Tell us a little bit about Hale Consulting.
Yeah, well, I've been doing nonprofit nuts and bolts for more than 20 years now. I got my start in a small little nonprofit and little by little worked my way up through a number of interesting and great organizations. And then after finishing 4 years as the Chief Financial and Operations Officer at a capacity building organization here in Austin, Texas, at Mission Capital, I decided I wanted to do more client-facing work. And so I set up my own shingle. And my team and I, we help nonprofits to build strong back offices, from doing administrative assessments to kind of help people figure out what's working well here, what could use some improvement. We do interim accounting work, and we also do fractional CFO work, which is basically having a CFO come in, not for full time, but for like 10, 15, 20 hours a month to help provide that higher level financial analysis, support with the budgeting, support with some of those other functions that most bookkeepers is just outside of their wheelhouse.
I did not know you did that, Sean. That's really interesting. So wait a minute. So when you talk about back office, that is really a lot of what I think about often, like in regular businesses, they'll hire somebody else to do bookkeeping or, like a back office type group. I didn't know you offered that. So that's exciting to me.
It is. It's one of our favorite things to do, because once we help the organizations really use that financial information, they can make such great strategic financial decisions. When the report's just something that the organization has to do, then it's almost a waste of money, right? But when you use that to drive strategic decision making, when you use it to make big choices and avoid big barriers, like that can really be a game changer for the organization. And it can help you get the board and the management all pulling in the same direction. And so we love taking organizations from like this eyes glaze over when the financial reports come out, to people digging in and asking good questions and feeling ownership of the organization's finances, which really they should.
Do you do that with boards? Like, for instance, because I know a lot of boards with the eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
Financials. So what do you do? Do you do trainings for boards? What do you do?
I just did a training last week. And so, yeah, I can absolutely love to do that, and do trainings for staff, and also just part of the ongoing part of what a fractional CFO will typically do is go to the board meetings and actually present and so there'll be like a written translation of the financial reports, but then there's also a verbal one to really help everybody focus their energy on and their attention on what's important in the financial reports, so they can keep their eyes on the prize. Because if you're not comfortable with those reports, it's easy to get lost and spend a lot of time talking about, well, why is the pencil budget over by 32 cents? And that's the last thing you should be worried about, probably.
Yes, exactly. So some nonprofits are fortunate to have some reserves, but we know that a lot of them haven't been able to build reserves. Is there some kind of best practice or an amount of funds you would suggest that any nonprofit have in reserve?
Sometimes you'll hear a rule of thumb, and if you listen to enough of them, you'll realize that none of them are exactly the same. And so, what if I had to put a rule of thumb out there, then rather than saying, oh, it has to be 3 months of reserves or 6 months of reserves or a year of reserves or something like that, I would put out, because that numbers like that can feel overwhelming. And the last thing we want to do is set a goal that feels so overwhelming that we don't get started. And so instead, I would think about this as Rome wasn't built in a day. And if our organization can put away 2 weeks worth of reserves every year, then those are good sized baby steps, so that over the course of a decade, you're building up 5 months of reserves. And five months, that maybe that's not where you stop, but that's enough money that, if we have another pandemic or we have more, craziness, or your organization hits a couple of rough spots, that's a really good nest egg to be able to fall back on.
Wow.
And yeah,
And that doesn't seem overwhelming.
not
That's not,
not when you take baby steps, right? And
yeah,
just
yeah,
2 weeks, like if you're a uh, $520,000 organization, then you're spending $10,000 a week, and so you budget. Part of your budget is to have a $20,000 profit, right? And
wow.
you just make sure that you bring in 20,000 more than you spend, and then that's going to
For the whole
slowly,
year, for the whole year.
yeah, for the whole year, yeah. You just
Wow.
you aim to
Okay.
save that, because yeah, if you try to get to a month or 3 months or 6 months all in 1 year or 2 year, forget about it. And
Overwhelming.
something's going to come along that you need that year, and it's hard to do that.
Mhm.
It's really hard, and then you give up. So I'd much rather, let's take good, reasonable steps, and we will get there.
A whole nother topic that we don't have time to cover would be, then what do you do with that money? Do you invest it? That's a whole nother topic. We'll do that one some other time.
We'll do that some other time, and I have a blog on that, because yeah, right now with inflation, you don't leave it in your checking account. You make sure
Oh,
that you're at least keeping up with inflation, and so
okay.
people can see that blog's posting on my website.
Yeah, let's do that at the end. It's 11:06. Okay. So how might a nonprofit begin to build reserves if they either don't have a reserve or perhaps don't have enough of a reserve? What are the tips you can give us?
Yeah, well, there are two traditional ways to do that, and then there's this secret way that it's not a big secret, but for some reason it's not on a lot of people's radar screen. So some organizations, they take the approach of, well, that means we have to cut our expenses, right? And so that means, oh, we will, then that they start to think, well, gee, that means like we won't give raises to people this year,
Mhm.
or we won't get the new van that we need, or whatever. That's not a very good way to go about building reserves, because you can end up doing damage to the organization by
Mhm.
doing that kind of cutting. Other organizations say, well, we'll bring in more money. And granted, more money is always a great thing, right? Whenever we can wave a magic wand and bring in twice as much or 3 times as much, we love that. And that's great if you can do it. But most organizations are already doing pretty, there's always room for improvement, but you don't necessarily want to build your reserve strategy based on that. And so there are these things that I kind of think of as hidden savings. And again, it's not a secret, and I've posted all about it on my website. But there's just money that most nonprofits, the administrative staff and the other leadership, we are usually so busy doing the day-to-day work, just
Mhm.
making sure that the lights stay on and people get paid, and that the programs get delivered with quality, and that we're following up with the donors, and like for almost every organization I run into, it's more than 40 hours a week. And
Mhm.
so then
Mhm.
it's hard to do things like dig in and do an administrative assessment, like the way that been doing things for the last 5 or 10 years, is that still cutting edge technology? A lot of times it isn't. A lot of times there are ways to leverage technology in a way that's going to let you work more efficiently. And if you can free up the executive director's time, for example, if you free up an executive director's time, let's just say all you do is you free up 24 hours over the course of the year. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a dozen coffees with potential donors, right? That can have a real payoff, right? And if your technology is not the most efficient, it hasn't kept pace, or do you even know if your technology's kept pace? That's something to look at, right?
Interesting.
Yeah,
Can I just ask you a quick question? Do you
yeah,
guys evaluate technology for nonprofits?
we do. It's a I wouldn't say that we are deep technology experts. And so when I the best analogy I can think of for what we do, it's kind of like going to your family doctor. And sometimes your family doctor is going to say, take 2 of these and call me in the morning, or we're going
Mhm.
to do a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Sometimes the family doctor is going to say, I don't like the look of this thing on your arm, and I want to send you to go see my buddy, the oncologist, who's going to help us make sure, like, is this, is this
Okay.
nothing or is this something to worry about? But you definitely want to get over to the oncologist, PDQ, right? Just to be safe. And so so we can, sometimes we can diagnose and make recommendations. Sometimes we will send people to, this is a serious thing. You should go talk to somebody who really knows about that. So just depends on the nature of the circumstances. But fortunately, we have my team and I, we happen to know a lot of people who do a lot of things. And so we're really happy to take those calls. And if we're not a good match for, like, assessing the technology, like, somebody really wants to dig deep on what the right donor management system might be for them. And, like, they've outgrown this one, they've outgrown that one. And so, we might, we might give them a few ideas for who to consider, but if they want to have somebody really working alongside them to make sure that they're getting the best tool and that they get it set up right, like, there are people we would refer them to.
Okay. Now I stopped you. We talked about technology. What else? What other tips?
Yeah, so there's technology. There is I'm checking my little notes here. Yeah, zombie expenses and blind spots is a big one. Because, and this can happen to anybody. This can happen to great organizations. And to give me an example, of having a beer with a friend of mine who was an interim executive director of a nonprofit. And he was telling me about how his first, like, he goes in first week and the landlord comes to him and says, hey, we're going to need you to leave when your lease is up, because our business, they'd gotten a sweetheart deal from their landlord. The landlord loved the mission, but needed room for their growing business. And so landlord said, hey, so when the lease is up, we need you to leave. And, my friend's eyes got big because, for their nonprofit, like, they knew they were getting a sweetheart deal. So rent's going to go way up, and moving, it's highly disruptive to any organization, right? You lose time, you lose paperwork, all this other stuff. And so he's like, what do I do? What do I do? And talked to his team and talked to his board. They didn't have any ideas. And he's still new at this organization. One day he's just sitting there thinking, and he asks one of the staff, he says, hey, that room over there, what do we use it for? They had this room full of, like, shelves and paperwork and this, that, and the other. And the person shrugged. And so he asked the rest of the staff and they didn't know. And he asked the board and they didn't know. They had a whole room at their organization that they'd been using to keep paperwork that nobody in the organization had been using for years. There was no living institutional memory of what that room was about. So they shred they check to make sure they're not, like, throwing away, like, $1 million, stock certificates, but they shred all that stuff. They give that room back to the landlord. They didn't have to move. And they were able to save $400 a month because they'd been renting this room for who knows how long that they didn't need. And so
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
massive hidden savings there. And the thing is that we get so busy that,
That's right.
and once we're there at the organization for long enough, we're not even looking at it with fresh eyes anymore. And so,
Mhm.
folks, you might have one of these situations at your organization. And so how can you start to look at things with fresh eyes? Or, because can you bring in a friend? Can you bring in a specialist who can ask those questions about those things that might be right under your nose
Exactly.
and can save you thousands of dollars?
I think that's critical. What I remember when I started at Travis Audubon Society, um, one of the first things I did is review their insurance policies that hadn't been done in years. And they weren't even adequately covered for the field trips, for instance, liability. They lead these great birding tours and educational tours, and they didn't have that. And then another organization I work at didn't have volunteers covered. Oh my goodness. I mean, what nonprofit doesn't have volunteers covered? So I think just reviewing your insurance is another critical thing. And we just don't, you're right. We get way too busy to even look sometimes. So
Yeah.
look, you know what? We only have a minute left, and Sean has a lot more to offer in terms of tips. So what I would like to suggest, and I'm going to do this in the comments when we're all done, I'm going to do a link to Sean's website and to his blog, because these tips are on his website, in his blog. And also he has got the best, first of all, I love Sean's website. It's really organized and
Thank you.
clean, and pretty.
Thank
I
you.
love that website. And the articles are very organized, and you can go down and see all these lovely articles that he's written. And they don't take a long time to read. They're not very long. So I want to suggest that you go on, I'll do that link, and then and maybe I'll link right to the blog page so they have choices, right? But you'll read more of these tips. And we're right at 11:15. I know this time goes fast. The other thing that Sean mentioned, and I want to say, is that the technology, this month's meetup is on the database choices we make, the choices as well as the use of our database. So please come to our meetup this month. I think you're going to be really impressed. Those of you who know Stephen from Bloomerang, he is a dynamo. I love this guy. So please come to that meetup. And next Tuesday, we have Mike Abkowitz, the Director of Finance and Operations at Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and he'll be talking about nonprofit budgeting. Okay, so listen, folks, thank you for showing up. And Sean, once again, thanks so much for your wisdom and experience that you share with us. And I'm just very excited for your business that you have taken off and offers so much to nonprofits in our community.
Oh, Nancy, thank you. It's always a pleasure catching up with you. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to connect with everybody at Austin Nonprofit Meetup.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you later.